A damp Donington Park welcomes the teams and drivers in the final round of the Intelligent Money British GT Championship. The Donington Decider, always a highlight of the season, but with these weather conditions, it's going to have an extra level of complexity. Wet Pirelli tyres being fitted to the cars as they prepare to make their way out onto the circuit for the final time before the all-important championship decider a bit later on today. A 15-minute warm-up session. The last chance then for the teams and drivers to take a look at the place, see what the track conditions are like, and maybe learn something should we have a wet race a little bit later on. Andy McEwan up in the commentary box once again this weekend. Joe Osborne alongside me. And Joe, a warm-up session doesn't always seem to have a huge amount of relevance towards the rest of the weekend. Teams really don't want to take any risks. They don't really want to put any unnecessary mileage on the cars. But in these conditions, should they persevere for the race later on, this actually is quite an important 15 minutes.
Massively, it's imperative actually. We've pretty much had 5 hours of track activity before today, all of it dry running, actually quite nice as well, and the teams have been tweaking things, looking for tenths of a second, then suddenly Mother Nature throws this at us, and these sort of conditions we're probably looking at a lap time delta of in between 8 and 10 seconds slower, obviously, like you alluded to, different tyres, so the teams will have a wet setup to fall back on, but every track is very different in the wet due to the surfaces and other cars that have been on it. And there's the old urban legend here at Donington Park that East Midlands Airport next door, there's some aviation fuel and gases fall on the track, hence why it's so slippy. Not sure I buy fully into it, but when you drive it, it is very, very slippy. So yeah, be interested to see how the teams tackle this.
Yes, because this isn't just any other race either. It is the championship decider, as we've said. Within GT3 in particular, things are very, very tight. 5 teams going for the championship here at the final 2-hour race of the season. And already we've had a bit of drama for some of our championship contenders, namely our championship leaders, actually. Dennis Lind and Leo Machitsky in qualifying yesterday, having a spin in the first part of qualifying when Leo was in the car, and that was already, Joe, sort of, we were saying, might be playing on Leo's mind. It's easy enough to spin one of these cars at the best of times. Now that it's wet, though, does that just, this is probably a daft question, does it add extra pressure to the team that just have to stay out of trouble to wrap up the championship?
Yeah, I mean, there's no stupid questions apart from that one, but no, it is difficult as an AM driver. They will be lucky in regards that the last round at Oulton Park was wet, so it's not that long ago that they've got to try and recall how the car feels. But today, this weekend, Leo would have just wanted, as we see a car already looped around. I think that's probably out of Redgate, turn 1. Looks like a McLaren GT3 to me, can't quite tell. Looks like the RJN Mere Fluid 21 car. Says you and Hanky in the car at the moment. And that might just be a sort of innocent mistake. There's lots of driver aids on the car, traction control being the main one. That might have just not been in the right setting, leaving the pit lane. First time you press the throttle is out of there, and before you know it, you're facing the wrong way.
Yes. Sort of going to prove our point that it is slippery out there and that it's going to be easy to make mistakes like that, and should we have a wet start to the race later on in particular, that could prove to be important. Joe is absolutely right. We had a wet race last time out at Oulton Park. We had another one actually at Snetterton. The last 2 events have been double headers, and on both occasions the second race of the weekend started wet and stayed wet throughout. They're also the only 2 races this year, of those that Dennis Lind and Leo Machitsky have finished anyway, that they weren't on the podium. So are Barwell struggling in the wet? Is it that driver combo that doesn't like the wet, or is that just a coincidence?
It's a great stat, so well done for working that one out firstly. But knowing Leo, knowing Dennis, and knowing Barwell and the Lamborghini, there isn't a weak link in what should be in the wet. That Bentley, however, is a very difficult car to drive in the wet. We've seen it over the years. It's very, very difficult. Jordan, where it's quite hard to see what he's probably done there. I'd imagine it's a really lazy spin on throttle, and it's just spat him to the left. Doesn't look like he's made contact with the barrier, so select and reverse is always very difficult in a race car, normally because you're in a forward gear, so not only do you have to find neutral, you then have to go another one, and when the rear axle is static, the gearbox tends to go dog to dog, so looks like you're being lazy and a bit stupid, but it is a frantic panic in there, always trying to find reverse.
We talk about how Barwell perhaps haven't enjoyed the wet conditions so far this year. This team, though, absolutely have. Our first wet race of the year at Snetterton was won by Hjalmar Berman and Ian Loggy, and they backed that up with a 3rd place finish last time out at Oulton Park in the wet as well. They are Machitsky and Lind's nearest rivals. 18.5 points back in the championship. They're going to start pretty close together on the grid as well, but neither of those teams actually had the best of times in yesterday's qualifying session. Instead, it was Phil Keane and Michael Igoe that claimed the GT3 pole position. Looks as though Jordan Witt is in the process of recovering from this moment down at the Melbourne hairpin. He's found reverse and now seemingly can't get it back in first gear, or maybe he's just waiting for a gap in the traffic, which is not going to be easy to do because we've got 25 cars out there at the moment across both of the classes, and more joining from the pit lane as we speak. So it's a busy circuit here at Donington. That does, though, Joe, mean that if the rain stops, which I don't think it has yet, but if it does stop, these Pirelli tyres, they're quite good at clearing the standing water, aren't they? We might just get a dry track as we go into the day. Yeah,
as we see Witt going, looks like he's going to be getting some bonus from Pirelli potentially. We get a front shot of that car, so he'll have to box because all the radiators will be completely blocked, although it actually only looks like maybe the first quarter of it. It's just a pie, isn't it, on the front of that car, but at least he can get going. But yeah, like you're alluding to, the Pirelli Wets are actually a brilliant tyre. They can run in pretty dry conditions without falling off a cliff performance-wise. As we go on board with Igoe, that really shows you the spray clearing, not only from the tyres, but those bigger droplets getting spat out of the diffuser. So that's pulling the water literally out of the ground as the car runs over it, and it throws that up into a rooster tail, and that really dries the circuit. But for me at the moment, considering race start at 1 o'clock, it's 50-50 if you're going to be starting on slicks or wets this far out. So that's why we're seeing all cars on track, lots of pros in the cars as well, which historically they don't get in so much warm-up, but they're going to be wanting to hone in a wet setup as quickly as they can. 15 minutes isn't an easy task.
What you just said, Joe, is music to my ears, because we've had a few races this year where there have been pretty last-minute calls about what tyres to start the race on, and I love situations like that because, again, it puts a little bit of the pressure on the teams as well to get the decision right, not just because they want to try and win the race, but those that are fighting for a championship go out there on the wrong tyres, especially if you go for slicks and the track is still too wet. That could have huge ramifications for how your afternoon and this final race of the season goes. So, yeah, stick around, everyone. This is going to be a dramatic day. It always is here at Donington Park, but the autumnal weather adding to that tension today. Michael Igoe here is in the WPI car and is on the grass by the looks of it as he tried to go on the inside, I think, of their championship rivals, number 63, who were doing their best to get out of the way. Igoe is in the 18. I'm going to guess it's Machitsky in the 63. Yes, it is. So both of those teams, interestingly, sticking their AM driver in first, which is sort of going against the grain when you look at what some of the other teams do.
Yeah, I'd say they're really the only two GT3 cars doing that. They're probably the most experienced with their cars and the conditions, so maybe they're happy with their wet setup, and it's more about here. So yeah, as you said, Machitsky on the outside, Igoe makes move to the inside, and Leo's turned in and just not seen him. I don't think that's malice. I don't think that's starting, and Igoe did really well to have that sort of 5% in the sort of back just to kind of help out and not make any contact.
Yes, well, that would have been a talking point, wouldn't it, if they'd have come together before the race even started, those two, but thankfully they avoided that. In the pit lane, meanwhile, we've got the number 8 Mercedes, that's Richard and Sam Neary going through a bit of a driver change. They're going to be contenders here today, I reckon. They won, of course, last time we were at Donington Park after that terrific opening lap for Richard. Saw him go from 10th on the grid to 2nd by the time he came after the first corner, and we know it's a circuit that car goes well out. Got their best ever qualifying result yesterday as well. The Nearys, they'll line up 3rd in the GT3 field. Now, we haven't really touched upon GT4 just now. GT4 is a tad less complicated than GT3 because at least the overall championship has been wrapped up. Will Burns and Gus Burton already champions after a win in the wet at Alton last time. Big drift there from the Academy Motorsport Ford Mustang, which, Joe, I would have thought would be an absolute pig to drive in the wet. And yet, our first wet race of the year at Snetterton was won by the Academy Motorsport Ford Mustang, so they're doing something right with their wet setup, aren't they? Yeah,
I think maybe not a pig, maybe a mule, considering it's a Mustang, but yeah, it looks good in the wet. I mean, the big slide was nice. From a driver perspective, you're always battling front end and rear end grip, and at least when the rear rotates like that, you can actually control the understeer. And it's a strong tool, the throttle pedal, in these sort of conditions in balancing the car. So it does look good to me. Really sort of complete car. All the traction control and ABS systems always seem to work well. You can see it on that Ginetta. The Ginetta's squirreling for grip, that bit lighter, so it gets away. I think under braking, you'll see that Mustang being a lot stronger and being able to trust those systems and basically brake as hard as you can and let the ABS deal with it. I mean, these conditions are actually getting worse, I think. Vision-wise and visibility is going to be getting hard. Depending on the cars, some cars simply just have normal mirrors, so you obviously see behind there. And then the higher spec cars, you can actually have a rear view camera, and then on top of that you can have a rear radar which illuminates how close the car is, what side it is. So when we go on board with some cars, we'll try and spot which have what systems, and as a driver it just means that you can concentrate a little bit more on looking forward, and then when you get a light on the radar, for example, then you check your mirror. So it's difficult out there in conditions like this.
Yes, and that of course starts to take on relevance after the when we get into traffic in the race. Now, a fairly animated conversation there. Leo Machitsky was using lots of hand gestures, and his body language didn't look terribly happy. They're pushing the car forward, so it looked as though this was just going to be a standard sort of practice pit stop, and that does now look like it's what they're doing. But Leo wasn't very happy, was he, really? And that's not particularly the demeanour you want to see from the championship leader. Dennis Lynn, though, rarely rattled, is he, Dennis? And he has put in some good performances in the wet this year. Off at Redgate has gone Adam Ballon, another championship contender then, the #1 car that won the championship last year, of course. Sandy Mitchell, reigning champion. Adam Ballon didn't win it last year. They're a new driver combo for 2021. And Adam also having a bit of a slip-up. We're seeing an awful lot of mistakes here, or moments, from championship contenders.
Yeah, as we were on board there, I thought we were going straight on at the old hairpin as well, and just really treacherous conditions. The wet's one thing, but when it's this cold, you just struggle to keep any temperature in the tyres. The wets obviously have a lot lower operating window than the slicks. The slicks are like 100 degrees, so boiling temperature for water. The wets, if you can be anywhere above 35, you start to feel more grip. But with ambient being like 11 degrees and it feeling cold, I think all of these guys are going to be struggling to keep tyre pressures up and tyre temps. So the team's probably going to take this data and maybe look at boosting those tyre pressures. The higher the tyre pressure, the easier the wet warms up because the air's denser, those molecules hit each other, was what I was told in physics quite a few years ago, and I believe it. So yeah, that's probably going to be the most critical setup you're going to do, is your tyre pressure, which everyone does at Tesco's garage. So it doesn't look hugely technical, but the amount of numbers you can get wrong on that is vast.
So I'm just making notes after my science lesson there with Mr. Osborne. All interesting stuff, though. This is what happened to Adam. He was trying to go on the inside of the Assetto Ginetta on a slightly tighter line. That's not the line where the grip is traditionally in the wet either, is it? So I think when he hit the throttle with that much extra steering lock on, the car just rotated. On board, we can see here he's very much aware of the fact that Ginetta is there. And as soon as he even looked at that right-hand pedal, the rear wheel spun. Yeah,
definitely, you've hit the nail on the spot with everything. And the racing line is slippier than the off the racing line, purely because it's driven on so much. So the aggregate is smoothed out, so it's got less friction, less abrasion. But then there's also more oil, there's rubber from the tyres, which doesn't react particularly well with water, as we know. So it is always that bit slippier, and a huge amount, like 20-25%. So that's why you see cars searching for grip round the outside. It's not the optimal line, it's longer, and in some cases a sharper angle, but the physical grip you've got is that much higher, than it is quicker. And that's, we'll see lots of different lines. There isn't a right or a wrong. It depends on your car, your tyres, lots of factors, and that's why the wet for me is so exciting. The driver makes such a big difference in these scenarios.
And there will be situations, won't there, in the race, like we saw for Ballon, where you're going to be forced off that optimal line, be it to overtake someone for position, or more likely a back marker, as was the case there. So that's just another hurdle for the drivers to have to jump once we get into the race later on. And you know, this warm-up session perhaps giving us a bit of a taste for what might happen a bit later this afternoon. The lap times, by the way, for what they're worth, it doesn't actually count towards anything, this warm-up session, but it's always good to see who's setting the pace, and it is Ian Loggy who is fastest at the moment, a 1 minute 46.493, a whopping 2.7 seconds faster than Sam Neary. Now, Sam, I think, has only just got into that car. He's going quicker again on this next lap now, so Sam might be about to jump to the top of the times, but that is a seriously impressive pace, and the Mercedes working well, clearly, because they're 1-2, and then another front-engine car, third fastest, actually, the Beech Dean Aston Martin of Andrew Howard, whilst in GT4, it is the Ford Mustang of Will Moore that's fastest. Ashley Marshall's McLaren, easy for me to say, is second fastest, with Alan Volant third in another of the McLarens, this one run by Rocket RJN. Sam Neary with a bit of a wobble out of the chicane. Sam, we know, is quick, and this car does seem to work well in the wet. Is it fair to say, Firing up the inside goes Dennis Lind. I wasn't convinced he was going to stop it then, but he did. Is it fair to say, Joe, that a front-engine car is a bit more stable in these conditions than, for example, a mid-engine Lamborghini?
I don't think stable is what I'll describe it. It's just a bit more even, obviously, with the big lump of metal over the front axle, and then historically the differential, the gearbox and the fuel tank over the rear. It just gives it a bit more of an even feel for the driver, so they're able to turn in with confidence because they've got that weight on the front end. Whereas the mid-engine cars, or the one with it in the boot, the Porsche, you really have to manipulate the brake pressure to keep the weight on the front, trail the brakes in. And it's not slower, but it's definitely harder to be precise with it that way. You don't have the physical lump of 100 kilos of engine over that front axle. So, I mean, the Bentley really holding Lind up there. I think there's even a bit of contact, yellow flag for a Toyota in the gravel track at the old hairpin. So, considering this is just a warm-up, we're getting warmed up for a pretty big event here, I think, this afternoon.
I mean, it's entertaining and all that, but I'm not convinced Dennis Lind needed to be taking those sort of risks, almost running into the back of the Bentley ahead of him, the Paddock Motorsport car. That's Jamie Caroline off the road. Not words that you can say that often, actually, but that has brought out a red flag with a minute to go in the session, and Jamie is beached in the gravel a long way off the road, but it would need recovering, and with only a minute left, not really enough time to do that.
Yeah, I think, wasn't he the cause of the other red flag of the weekend as well, I think? So
yes.
I think he's been a bit of a gravel friend this weekend. Obviously, he's done some good lap times, but as soon as you do that in the race, that's game over sort of thing. So we're talking about these AMs having little spins and stuff, maybe costing 10 seconds, but that's a game over scenario there. So I'm not sure what's caused it, but the way he's gone off, I'd actually say he's probably gone in too fast into the left hand of Craners, maybe touched the grass on the right before hitting the brakes, and he's gone to the left, and looks like he's gone in deep, and that's probably because he's doing 180, 190 kilometres an hour as he lost control of that car.
They do seem to set that Toyota up to be quite edgy, don't they? They throw it around, but it seems to move around a lot. I'm guessing it's what John and Jamie like the car to handle like, and Scott McKenna, who was in that car earlier this year, the same, but I guess in the wet, that maybe doesn't give you quite the levels of grip and confidence that you'd like. So Jamie Caroline, unfortunately, brings about an early end to the session, getting confirmation now the session won't restart with only 1 minute on the clock. It's Phil Keane that is fastest in the session then. It's actually going to be a Lamborghini 1-2, having said the front engine cars were looking strong. As soon as the pros started jumping into those cars at the end, they went quicker. So Phil Keane and Dennis Lind only got a couple of laps in, but they are first and second, with Ian Loggy third and Sam Neary fourth. So 2 Lamborghinis followed by 2 Mercedes in the top 4. Andrew Howard in the Beach Dean Aston Martin 5th position. Rain might really be the only thing that keeps Andrew in this championship hunt, because that number 7 car hasn't looked that rapid in the dry this weekend, but in the wet, he and Johnny Adam are both pretty handy, it must be said, and the car on the pace here this morning.
Yeah, so just looking at this off, you can actually see the polystyrene board that's been destroyed on the left-hand side, just where that X5 is now, to his left as we look at it. So yeah, that would have been quite a scary off, to be fair. I would have thought that's probably done some floor damage and splitter damage as it's dug in there. So those guys have got some serious work to do. But I think the wet definitely adds so much spice to it that it makes it a lot harder to call which way it's going to go. I think one interesting thing there is actually Sandy Mitchell only got an outlap then. His Adam Ballon was one of the last to stop after that little spin we saw. So Sandy now potentially is going into a wet race of doing an out and an in lap, working out where the grip is. So all of these little factors start to add up across the race. And I think, like we said, I think Lind and Keane were quick yesterday in the dry, and that's translated to the wet importantly for them.
And of course the pro drivers, particularly for Sandy Mitchell, as you said, didn't get much running there. The first time he jumps into the car will be in the middle of the race as well. He doesn't even get an out lap or a warm-up lap to try and gauge the conditions, because the race will be started by the AM drivers in GT3. So that is always the way with these endurance races. Anyway, the 1 hour races it sometimes changes, but for the 2 and 3 hour races, it's the AM that starts. It means that if it is wet, we may well end up with a safety car start, but I'm sure we'll still have plenty of drama and excitement once the race does get underway. So a very wet but a very entertaining morning warm-up session is complete here at Donington Park, and it's a Lamborghini 1-2, and it's 2 of our championship contenders. The pole sitters, Phil Keane and Mike Ligo, fastest, ahead of the championship leaders, Dennis Lind and Leo Machitsky for Barwell. Ian Loggy and Yelmer Berman, third fastest for Ram Racing, ahead of another Mercedes, the Team ABBA racing car of Sam and Richard Neary. Andrew Howard and Johnny Adam rounding out the top 5 in the GT3 ranks. So the Intelligent Money British GT Championship then coming to a close this weekend at Donington Park, and we're very, very happy to have the continued support of Intelligent Money. And with more on that subject, we can welcome into our broadcast Bryn Lucas down in the pit lane.
Down in a very, very wet, dank pit lane. It is horrible, but we've got Nick here to talk a little bit about Intelligent Money, the sponsors, and what the season's been like really with COVID and the continued deal you have with sponsoring the British GT.
Yeah, it's good, just great to get people back out of the track. The atmosphere today is great. Might be a little bit damp, but that makes it a little bit more interesting out on the track, I think. And great to get down to the last weekend and still have people in contention, so there's still a bit of competition out there. So
yeah, it is nice to have people watching these races and actually being at the circuits, and it is beautifully set up as well with these 5 drivers or 5 teams that can win the title too in GT3.
Always good to bring it to the wire, and so the buzz around the place, as you kind of say, it's great. I think people are enjoying being back out, so it's been great to be able to support during what's been a tough year for everybody. I think great to have managed to work with Sky at the back end of last season to get Jensen and Chris out to kind of finish that off and keep a bit of atmosphere and people interested, and we're looking forward to getting through next season as well and getting a full season of racing in.
Well, let's talk very quickly about next season. You know, 2022 is just a few months away now, and obviously the continued sponsorship from Intelligent Money as well for the British GT. Fans back, racing back like normal, we hope?
Yeah, no, very much so. Last 2 events we've managed to bring some guests along as well, so they love that as well. So we're really looking forward to being able to do that again all next season. So looking forward to a full season of racing. I think it'll be great. Yeah, well, look, thank you very much indeed, Nick. It's going to be very exciting to see what happens in 2022, and it's going to be very, very exciting to see what happens in the back end of 2021, because 12:35 Sky Sports F1 channel for here all the action on the British GT.